Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to see all of you here today. Thanks so much for making the time. I'm especially excited today to welcome Professor Erik Brynjolfsson from MIT. And I'll tell you a bit about him in a minute. I did see from his CV before coming here today that prior to today, he has given 683 invited presentations. And I'm very confident that today, number 684 is going to be his most enjoyable yet. So now just a bit for Professor Brynjolfsson, and I'll get out of the way so you can hear from him. He is the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, the Schussel Family Professor at the MIT Sloan School, and the chairman of the MIT Sloan Management Review. His research examines the effects of information technologies on business strategy, on productivity and performance, on digital commerce and intangible assets. He teaches courses on the economics of information and in the analytics lab at MIT. He actually was one of the very first researchers to really try to tackle the productivity contributions of information technology, and his research is incredibly highly regarded. He also provided some of the first estimates of the value of online product variety, and his research has appeared again and again and again in leading economics, management, and science journals, and he's been recognized with 10 Best Paper Awards and 5 patents. Today, he'll be talking about one of the many books that he has authored or co-edited. This one is the New York Times bestseller, The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. He actually, today is the first time that I've met Professor Brynjolfsson, despite our having been educated in the same place, hanging out a lot in Boston, fellow Red Sox fans. We apparently grew up very close to one another, which I learned for the first time today. Interestingly, the person who donated, who gave the funds to MIT for his chair at MIT, my mom was this person's secretary for many, many years. So it is like yet another connection. So we have so many connections. It's really quite something. So he's taught at Harvard and at Stanford, so we're delighted to welcome him back here today. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Erik Brynjolfsson.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. It's a real delight to be here, and I wish we had crossed paths when we were 8 years old or whenever it was that we were living together, but I'm glad it finally happened. And it's a delight to be here and get a chance to interact with all of you. I saw the guest list, and it's a really remarkably illustrious group of people, so I'm looking forward not just a chance to share some of the research that we've been doing at MIT in the Initiative on the Digital Economy, but hearing your questions and having some interactions, so I'll make sure I leave some time for us to be able to do that as well. So let me start off with a question, which is, how many people here would be interested in having the power to change the world? Change the world. Anybody? Okay, all right, okay, so I thought so. So what does it take to change the world? Well, there's a lot of different philosophies and ideas about what it really takes to change the world, but I'm going to come over with kind of an MIT perspective, which maybe is a Stanford perspective to some extent as well, an engineering perspective, that what it takes to change the world is really two things: a power system and a control system. You need a power system to be able to physically change the world. The world is held in place, by powerful forces, electromagnetism. We heard this morning, gravitational waves. I hope you guys saw the announcement about that. You need physical power to change the world, but that's not enough. You also need a control system. You need to know how to arrange things, where to put things, and how to organize things. If you have those two things, you can make big changes in the world. Now, looking back through most of history, both those functions were provided by us, by people. But then with the Industrial Revolution, we started figuring out how to use machines for the power system. And through most of human history, living standards were basically stagnant until the late 1700s, when we started using first the steam engine and later electricity and the internal combustion engine and other technologies to supplant human muscles and animal muscles with machinery. And that's why we are 100 times wealthier than our ancestors a couple hundred years ago, because of this compounding growth from using technology to augment the power system, augment our muscles. But that's not the end of the story. Now we are in the early days of what Andy McAfee and I call the second machine age, where we are beginning to do the same thing for the control system, for our brains, not just our muscles. As you know, there's machinery, computers, software, big data, that is beginning to allow machines to make decisions and to make judgments and to arrange things. And my view is that that's going to be at least as big a revolution as what the Industrial Revolution did for automating the power system, the muscles. And there are some similarities and differences. One is that both of them, I think, will lead to huge increases in wealth and prosperity, and I'll show you some data on that in a little while. But they're not quite the same. The pace of change is a bit different. I did the arithmetic, and it turned out that the steam engine did grow at in efficiency at an exponential rate. It doubled in power about every 70 years. After 140 years, it was twice as efficient. But as you know, especially here in Silicon Valley, Moore's law is doubling about every 2 years. So it's a much faster pace on some of these dimensions. And another potentially important difference is that the Industrial Revolution, those machines were mostly a complement for human muscles in the sense that the machinery made humans more valuable. So even though they replaced the muscle power, you still needed a control system. You still needed an engineer to run the train. And one way to see that is that wages were constantly going up. So the value of an hour of human labor became more and more valuable over time as these technologies diffused and improved. Now, in the second machine age, as we begin to use technology to automate and augment brains and the control system, it's not as obvious whether it's going to be a complement or a substitute on balance. In some places, it seems to be making human labor less valuable, other places more valuable. And again, I'll show you some data on that, but that may have some important implications for how the economy goes forward. So let me start in my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technologies that we have in mind, and I'll talk about the economic implications of it. So in terms of the technologies, let me go back a decade or so. When I was teaching a course on what machines could do well, and I used a terrific book by one of my colleagues, Frank Levy, and the class and I, we paralleled what Frank was saying, that there are some things that humans are just uniquely good at. Mobility, fine motor control, picking something up, language, communication, unstructured problem solving. And one of the canonical examples that's in the opening of this other book is driving a car. That's something that's so unstructured. Exactly. And I have to say, to be completely fair, I totally bought into that. I was like, yeah, that's something you just can't see how you could write a computer program to drive a car. There's all this unstructured data coming in. But obviously, that turned out to be wrong, much faster than we expected. Here's Andy and me. We're kind of grinning like idiots because we just survived a ride down Route 101 in this autonomous car here. Google gave us a ride from Mountain View up to San Francisco and back again. And so I was very wrong about not being able to have a machine do that. Now they're improving quite a bit. I bet you many of you in this room have ridden in some form of an autonomous car now, whether it's a Tesla or some of the other ones that are now available, better than the one that I just showed you here. But let's go through those other categories. Not just interacting with the physical world, but also language, problem solving. And in each one of them, there have been just momentous improvements over the past decade. And I spent a lot of time in the laboratories talking to people at MIT and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon about the improvements that are in the pipeline. And I'm really awestruck about how much things are advancing. And one of the nice things about coming out here to this area is the past 2 days I've been visiting with many of these people. And it's very striking how optimistic they are about what we're going to be able to do. So let me take each of them in turn there. In terms of interacting with the physical world, we're seeing big improvements in robotics. They're growing at double-digit rates in terms of the number of robots that are in place. This robot here is Baxter, a robot that cost about $25,000, developed by my former MIT colleague, Rod Brooks. He now runs this company, Rethink Robotics. And it's just doing very simple things. It's grabbing things off of this assembly line, putting them in the box. The neat thing about Baxter is it doesn't require any programming. You just show it. You hold its arm and you say, okay, pick this up and put this over here, and it learns from example. So you don't need to be a person in a factory can teach it without programming it. And it can work alongside humans. It has sensors so that it doesn't kill the person by swinging its arm. It very carefully avoids bumping into them, and if it does, it does that gently. And it works out that Baxter can do this for about the equivalent of $4 an hour, and the price is falling very rapidly with Moore's law and everything. And there are actually millions of people who do jobs basically like this, very boring jobs, taking stuff off of assembly lines and putting them in. Some in Massachusetts, it turns out, that I visited. And the robots are improving quite rapidly. Here's another robot. This one is Atlas, the one on the right there. That is the robot that competed in the DARPA Robotics Challenge recently. The MIT one came in 4th place, I'm sad to say. Early on in the competition, it tripped and it broke its arm and had to do the rest of the competition with only one arm. But the competition was very striking for what they had to do. The robots had to walk upstairs, they had to open a door and walk through it, turn a lever, had to pick up a hose and put a nozzle on it. They had to get into a car, sit down in it, grab the steering wheel, put its foot on the pedal, and drive the car a short distance to an obstacle course. So there's a whole set of things that it did in an increasingly autonomous way. And if you watch the videos, they're kind of funny. They were pretty clumsy. You can watch Atlas fall over, tripping. But you can also see that there's a path that this is very rapidly improving. And it's not hard to imagine that if you were an entrepreneur or a manager, you could take these capabilities and combine them in different ways and do some of the things that are currently done in warehouses or factories or other places. And it's not just humanoid robots. One of the scarier things you see around the MIT campus is this cheetah. Do not try to run away from it because it can run faster than any human. I was at the athletic building, and this was leaping over hurdles. So you could see it running around the course, and they would randomly put a hurdle in front of it, and the cheetah would recognize it and leap over it. So the US Army is very interested in these, so we get kind of a Star Wars kind of effect. And the sensors are also improving quite a bit. Here's the progress on ImageNet, which is the sort of most canonical, famous set of images that AI researchers use to test their programs. And so it's very standardized. And the images are too small for you to see what's in there, but there's lots of pictures of different things there, like people playing frisbee or a dog chasing a cat or something. The machines have to identify what it is and describe it. And it used to be, just a few years ago, that they got 30% of them wrong, and you can see how rapidly they're improving. Now there are less than 10% of them are incorrect. And part of it is this introduction of what's deep learning, these deep neural nets that sort of loosely mirror the way human brains work in terms of recognizing things. And the progress continues to be quite rapid in that. You could also go into the language area. I mentioned that earlier. These days, you may see somebody talking on their phone, and chances are pretty good they're not just talking on the phone to some other human. They may well be talking to the phone and expecting the phone, a machine, to answer them back. And they're not insane or anything. They actually are getting responses. And again, I wouldn't say it's great. There's sometimes get it incorrect. But if you want to know when the movie is playing or what the weather's going to be tomorrow or when the next flight is from SFO, you can answer these basic questions increasingly effectively, learning very rapidly. There's a chatbot in China called Xiao Ice that is having tens of millions of conversations simultaneously, mostly with teenage boys and girls, and helping them with their love lives and giving them advice on their parents and whatever else. And a lot of people seem to find those conversations plausible enough to continue with them. There's big improvements in translation. Skype, now you can talk into Skype in English and have it come out on the other side in French or German or other languages. And it's not perfect, but it's passable. I wouldn't negotiate $1 billion deal that way, but if you're just trying to get some basic information or say hi to a cousin or something in another country, you can have a passable conversation. A company just introduced a little pendant you can wear around your neck that will do real-time translation when you visit companies. I'm sure, I haven't heard yet, but I bet you there's somebody who's got a version that will fit in your ear, and you can kind of be like Star Trek that way. They're writing news stories, the third category there. Here's a New York Times news story, a story about the New York Times beating quarterly estimates written, published by the Associated Press. And I think the most interesting thing is down here in the corner that the author of it is someone called Automated Insights. That's not a human, that's a robot that generates these stories automatically. And I wouldn't use it for some complicated story. So far, I don't know of any economics journal papers that are written this way. But if it's something like an earnings report or a football score, in fact, Automated Insights generates tens of thousands of these sports stories every year for high school, college, professional, lots of other things. Just you get the box score, and you can generate a plausible story out of it. And the last category I mentioned was unstructured problem solving. A great example, I could give many examples, but a good one I think is the game show Jeopardy. Lots of unstructured questions there. Some of them are puns or rhymes. You have to know about geography, pop music, science, literature. Could be a question in any of those categories. And I had Dave Ferrucci come to my class at MIT, and he was the person who developed the IBM Watson system for playing Jeopardy. And he showed me this chart I want to share with you. It's really quite striking. The first thing he did was he got the data for all the games of Jeopardy that had ever been played and all the champions. And these little blue dots are all the human champions of Jeopardy ranked by how accurate they were. As you can see, some of them got 100% of the questions asked correct, and how aggressive they were. And many of them answered more than 50 or 60% of the questions in a given game. So they're all clustered in the top there because they're champions after all. They're really good at Jeopardy. And when he first introduced Watson to play it, it really was not very good at all back in 2006. It maybe got 20 or 30% of the questions correct. It's a line, not a dot, because he had a little dial. He could make it more aggressive or less aggressive about answering the questions. But Watson had one property that none of the humans had, and that was this ability to learn at a ferocious pace. So they started feeding Watson more and more information. All the information from Wikipedia is fed into it. Reading the internet, all the lengths of all the rivers, all the pop stars. And you can see each week, each month, Watson was improving at a ferocious rate. At one point, they gave it all the information in the Urban Dictionary. I don't know if you guys have read the Urban Dictionary. It turned out that was not a good idea. They had to wipe that part of the memory out. But by the time he gave this talk and he gave me the slide, it was they were already better than about half the Jeopardy champions there. And a couple months later, they went ahead and played Ken Jennings in the game of Jeopardy. And as you probably have heard, Watson beat Ken Jennings. And the world Jeopardy champion now is a computer. They won $75,000. But the point wasn't just to win $75,000. It was to test this technology for answering all sorts of questions, not just in Jeopardy, but think about it. You could apply the same basic technology to answering all sorts of questions. For instance, you could give it legal information, have it read the law library, and all that information is now available, and it can give legal advice, or it can read through documents as lawyers dump documents on each other. These tools can read through them and find the relevant parts that may be relevant to a particular case. They can be used in call centers. There's a version of Watson in a South African call center. People call in and Watson answers questions for them. They can give financial advice, medical diagnosis. And that's one of the things we'll talk about is the balance here, is figuring out which things humans can do well and which things machines can do well. And we could ask a machine to make those decisions. There are companies like NAC that are judging human capabilities and trying to match them up to particular jobs and slots as this goes forward. So what does it mean for the economy, its ability to have these technologies? And let me give you two big themes of what it's doing for the economy. The first is what I call the bounty, that it can create lots more wealth. There's lots more things that we can have and do that we couldn't have before because the technology allows that. And so it makes the pie bigger. And much of that isn't even measured very well. I was sent this newspaper ad from 1994. And the striking thing about it is pretty much everything on that ad is now available for no extra cost if you have a smartphone. Basically everything in there is there's the answering machine, if you remember what an answering machine is. There is a music player, there's a video player, there's a camera, there is a computer obviously. So all those things are bundled in at no extra cost. And they're basically free, and there's even things that didn't exist back then, like a GPS with turn-by-turn real-time driving directions and traffic conditions, or something that'll diagnose skin cancer. And the value of these things is enormous. It's probably about $300 billion a year of unmeasured free goods that are on top of what already is in the GDP. So we're getting a lot of valuable free stuff that we hadn't counted before. It's not counted in the GDP because the GDP counts the value of everything that's bought and sold. And if something is available for free, like say Wikipedia, it doesn't show up in the GDP statistics, even though it does have value to us. We also are seeing that there are trends in some of the other dimensions, like productivity, employment, median household income, as well as GDP. And for most of the past couple hundred years, those rose together. There was a rising tide that lifted all boats. But for the past 20 years, they've become decoupled. And so as you see here, productivity and GDP are still kind of going up. There's a few bumps, ups and downs there. But employment has basically stagnated. And in fact, if you normalize it by the population, the employment to population ratio has fallen. It's significantly lower now than it was in the 1990s. A smaller share of the workforce is employed. And median income is also stagnating. So median income is the income of the person at the 50th percentile. The GDP per person is going up, but the income at the 50th percentile and below is flat or going down. How can that be? Well, because it's becoming more uneven. Almost 80% of the growth in income has gone to the top 1% in the past 20 years. So that means that the other 80%, in particular 50% below, are not getting much improvement or any from the growing pie. So what's going on here? How can this be? Well, it traces back to a concept in economics called biased technical change. And it's basically the idea that while technology can make the pie bigger and increase overall wealth, there's no economic law, there's no guarantee that everyone's going to get a proportional share of that. In fact, there's no guarantee that everyone will get a positive share of that. It's possible for some people to be made worse off. And historically, that was a very small group. But in theory, there's nothing in the equations that prevents it from being 50% of the people or 80% of the people who are made worse off, and another group of people that are made much, much, much better off. And lately, that seems to be what's been happening. We've been having growing inequality, a growing pie, but also more unevenness. And let me dive in more deeply about the kinds of biased technical change that we're seeing. That is technical change that improves things but affects different groups differentially. Let me describe three in particular kinds of biased technical change. The first is skill biased technical change. The idea that different skill groups are affected differently. For instance, high skill groups versus middle and low skill groups. And so when you introduce a technology into a fast food store, for instance, that automates the people at front checkout. I was recently flying through LaGuardia, and most of the restaurants there had this kind of automated ordering system there. And I think we'll see more and more of these as one example. Then people who were being at the low end of the wage spectrum, they aren't really needed anymore. You may still need a manager or the entrepreneur who develops the store. So it's affecting different groups differentially. And the data show that this is not just an anecdote. This is something we see increasingly. If you group people by their educational background, as Daron Acemoglu and David Otter, my colleagues, did, what you see is that early on there was kind of a rising tide. Even if you were a high school dropout, you saw your wages going up in the first part of the century. Then everyone kind of stagnated with the oil shock in the 70s. And since then, there's been this fanning out, this spread where the people with more education have seen their wages go up again. But if you were at some college, high school, or high school dropout, your wages are stagnating or falling. And just to calibrate this, the median person in America is about some college. They're less than a college graduate, more than a high school graduate. So that's sort of the middle of the distribution and on down. So that's one kind of biased technical change, and it's in terms of high and low skill. If you drill in a little bit more deeply, it's actually the mid-skill workers that have been most affected, the people who are doing routine information processing work, accountants, middle managers. Those jobs have been especially affected. At the high end, very professional workers, entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, professors, they've actually done pretty well. And interestingly, at the low end, you've also seen things all right. Those people may be janitors, gardeners, people doing lots of physical tasks that haven't so far been as easy to automate. So it's kind of a U-shaped distribution so far, although you can imagine, I suggested the technology is beginning to affect the whole end of both ends of the spectrum as well as the middle. The second kind of bias technical change I'll mention is capital bias technical change, the idea that technology differentially affects capital versus labor. Travis Kalanick illustrated this very neatly when he said that when there's no other dude in the car, the cost of taking Uber anywhere becomes cheaper than owning a vehicle. Yes, that is the way he talks. He has recently hired away 50% of the artificial intelligence faculty at Carnegie Mellon University to work on driverless vehicles. And if he succeeds in that, which I think he will, then we're going to see lots more very cheap Ubers for lots of us. But the people who used to drive those cars won't be needed anymore. So you're going to have a shift in the capital-labor ratio there. More capital, less labor. And it's happening in factories. Terry Gou is doing that in some of the Foxconn factories in China, where he hopes to introduce 1 million robots to replace 1 million humans, he says. I don't know if he's going to succeed in that, but that's the path he's on. Apparently he's already done it with a couple 100,000. And the data, again, support this, that there has been a trend. Look at the red line here. This is the share of GDP going to labor. And it kind of bounces around with the business cycle. But since 2000, it's just been in one direction, going downward. And it's not just the United States. Karabanis and Neiman have looked at this throughout the OECD, all the wealthy countries. And you see a very similar pattern where the share of income going to labor is beginning to fall quite steeply. And in some ways, this even underestimates the effect, because labor here includes superstar, football players and CEOs. And so if the ordinary laborers are getting an even smaller share. Speaking of superstars, let me talk a little bit about what they differentiate. They're not necessarily in the capital or the regular labor category. They may be in the ideas or talent, or maybe it's luck category. And so many of you probably saw Lady Gaga sing the national anthem a couple of weeks ago at the Super Bowl. 100 million people watched her. She's got an amazing voice, and now that voice can be reaching hundreds of millions of people because of simple technologies like televisions. Scott Cook is a billionaire. He developed TurboTax, and that technology is now available to be replicated. If you are an H&R tax preparer, you don't want to have to compete against a $29 piece of software that can be replicated. And what you're seeing now is that these technologies are able to codify a lot of information that previously wasn't codified, and then digitize it. So if you codify something and then digitize it, you can replicate it. And each of those replicas has 3 interesting properties. They can be made at almost zero cost. A digital copy is very cheap to copy. They can be the exact replica of the original. There's no distinction between the copy and the original, unlike with atoms. And thirdly, they can be transmitted just about anywhere on the planet almost instantaneously at the speed of light. So free, perfect, and instant are 3 adjectives we didn't use to describe goods and services through most of history, but they're standard for digital goods. And of course, that leads to some very different kinds of economics. It tends to lead to winner-take-all or winner-take-most economics. You make one really good copy of, say, a tax program or whatever, and then you make copies of it for everybody. You don't need hundreds of thousands of human tax preparers. You have some team develop a really canonical example and replicate it. And you can do that in lots of other areas as well. And the result has been that some people at the very top of the income distribution have done extremely well. We've heard about the 1%. We've heard enough about them. Let's hear about, turns out the 1% has their own 1%, the 0.01%. So this is the 1% of the 1%. And if you look at the share of income going to them, that has been going up. And according to Thomas Piketty, is now at a record level now. And in fact, it's sort of a fractal quality. You could look at any stratum, and at the top of the income distribution, the top 1% of that group is getting a disproportionate share of the rest of that group. And there are many forces at work here. There's things going on with tax policy, with international trade. But one of the forces, I think, is the way that technology is allowing people with talent, ideas, or luck to replicate what they have to a much broader audience than they had before. So let me wrap up with a couple closing comments about what is it that we should be doing, what should we be doing going forward. Well, things have changed quite a bit, and one of the things that we've seen is the machines can now beat humans at many tasks. In fact, it was less than 20 years ago that Garry Kasparov played Deep Blue, a chess computer, and Deep Blue won that match. The computers are now the world chess champions. In fact, today, a chess program running on a cell phone can beat grandmasters. It's gotten to the point where Jan Donner, the Dutch chess champion, was asked, what strategy would you use against a chess computer? And he said, I would bring a hammer. So there's certainly that attitude that I think a lot of people have, that they're worried about, how are we going to stop these machines? They're taking our jobs, they're taking our chess championships. That's not the strategy I'm going to advocate. I think that, as I said earlier, these technologies are making the pie a lot bigger, but we need to think about how we can have our human skills, our organizations keep up with the technology. So the answer isn't to slow down or smash or stop the technology, it's to speed up our ability to adapt them. And if we can do that, if we can keep up with them, then I think we can create more shared prosperity. So I'd say there's a new grand challenge, the old one being to develop the self-driving car and the Doppler robotics challenge. I would like to have one in the area of institutions and organizations. Can we come up with a way to invent new business organizations and new ways of organizing work that allow society to keep up? And that's going to involve some new policies. It's going to involve changes in the way individuals work. And if we do that, I think we will be able to succeed in not only having the pie grow bigger, but have shared prosperity going forward. So let me leave it there and see if there's questions or comments that you all have. And if you'd like to learn more about it, there's some information at these different web links there. Thanks very much.
So thanks very much, Erik, for those insights. The book is really incredibly fascinating read. And one thing, just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there was another recent book that was very prominently featured by someone I think you know pretty well, Robert Gordon.
Sure.
Who, in this book, he sort of talks about there was a special time in the U.S., sort of from 1870 to 1970, or not just in the U.S., but in many other industrialized countries too, but that since then, we basically now, there's not very much to get excited about that's been happening of late or going forward, not a very exciting, and this contrasts somewhat with your view of this inflection point, and there's so much happening here. So perhaps you can talk a bit about your view on that.
Bob's a good, dear old friend. Every summer we get together in Cambridge at the NBR Summer Institute, and we have a dinner there. We invite some people like Nick Bloom and others to join us for dinner. We have a discussion about these topics. And we agree on a lot of things, and I agree, I should say, with about 70 or 80, maybe 90% of his book, the part about the past, which is what most of the book is, and he describes the wondrous technologies that were developed. I mentioned some of them here, in electricity and the dynamo. I think one of his favorites is the indoor plumbing and the flush toilet. I'm a big fan of that as well. But then when he goes forward, that's where I disagree with him. And I think he sort of has this logic that the past couple of years of productivity growth have been a little boring. He doesn't see anything really exciting happening. Ergo, there's nothing left to invent, and we've run out of time. And that logic just doesn't work for it. It doesn't make sense for me. And so since I have had this discussion with him a number of times, I went ahead and got some data on what's happening to productivity in any given 5-year period, and what does that predict for the next 5-year period, or any 10-year period for the next 10-year period. And it turns out that if you do that little exercise, that there's zero correlation from one period to the next period. So I don't think we can infer much from what happened in the past to the future. In fact, this idea of secular stagnation that he talks about a bit, that word, actually, he didn't coin it. That first came out in the late 1930s. Alvin Hansen came up with the idea of secular stagnation. And at the time, people were saying, well, growth is over. This is it. That's the end. We've invented the car, and like, what else is there left to invent? But as we know now, the next couple decades were the best decades of productivity growth that they'd ever seen. So the idea of secular stagnation was exactly wrong then. Now, going forward, I'm not guaranteeing that just because he's using that word again, we're going to have huge growth. But I think that when I go and visit the companies, I think that's the only way we can know for sure. Visit them and see the technologies in action. What I see just beginning to come in the pipeline now. It makes me very optimistic about the next 10 years because most of the technologies I mentioned, they're only at the earliest stages of diffusion. And as they roll out, I can't imagine them not having an enormous impact on productivity and living standards.
Right, okay, that's great. Can I ask one more and then I'll open it up. So in the book, you talk a fair amount about sort of key policy issues. Here we are at CEPR, Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and there are, I'm curious to get your sense, there have been many things that have happened in the U.S. economy over the last several decades, the increasing exposure to international trade, greater migration, and so forth, and those have affected the labor market in various ways. What do you think, as there's been so many exciting innovations that have come about, like the ones you describe here, for policymakers to sort of have on their radar screen going forward to optimize, maximally reap the benefits of these technologies?
Well, there's 3 chapters in the book about that, so I won't, but let me touch on a couple of high-level pieces of advice I would have. First off, I'd start with education. We're an institution of education, so it's a good one to talk about. And that's not, and there's always been this race between technology and education. The first Nobel Prize winners, we got 2 of them here, but the first one, Jan Tinbergen, he coined this phrase, race between technology and education, the driver of inequality. And so we want to speed up education, and that doesn't mean just spending more money on it, but it means reinventing education. So we do less teaching of routine information processing, memorizing facts. After all, that's exactly what computers do, routine information processing and storing facts. And more creativity, interpersonal skills, teamwork, leadership, motivation, things that humans are uniquely good at. And I think that people can learn those skills. So we could say more about education. I'm happy to go into it more later about other things we could do there. The second thing is entrepreneurship and speeding up business dynamism. As the old jobs get automated away, there's an instinct to try to freeze in place the old system, and that's exactly the wrong instinct. The better instinct is to try to create new jobs, new goods, new services that will replace the old one, what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Don't protect the past from the future, protect the future from the past. And we haven't been doing a very good job of that. Although Silicon Valley is bubbling with innovation, if you look at the overall US economy, entrepreneurship is actually down. John Haltowanger and Steve Davis have identified that we have less new business creation, fewer jobs being created in young firms. So we're not doing a very good job on that invention, creation. And I think there's things we can do in terms of occupational licensing and other things that could speed entrepreneurship. A third category is we have to think about our tax policy. A good rule from Economics 101 is if you want less of something, you tax it. If you want more of something, you subsidize it. If we want more work, more employment, more broadly shared prosperity, we shouldn't have all of our taxes and our burdens put on workers and employers. We should tax other things that we don't want, like pollution and congestion, or maybe rents and other things, and less on labor, and that would probably help. And we could even subsidize it, like with the earned income tax credit, rewarding people for working and for hiring people, instead of right now you pay extra taxes. And last but not least, I'd say there's a lot we can do in research and development and investing in inventing those new ideas and going forward, and that historically has been a font of growth as well.
That's great. So I know our CEPR communications team has surely been taking notes to share with our current presidential candidates, and I'm sure they will take all of these.
Yes, I bet you. I bet you Donald Trump is very interested in what I have to say.
That's right. That's right. So our first question, right up here.
So I was struck by that so much of what you could have said with some imagination could have been said by somebody back in the Industrial Revolution, even the title of your
Well, there's
book,
a reason for
right?
that. Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could have somebody saying work, progress, and prosperity, and these are brilliant technologies.
Yes.
I'm curious about what is different this time go around in terms of what might come next, thinking about what came after the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
There's some people have commented that in the past, the revolution occurred at the production level, and this revolution is occurring at the consumption level, and that makes it inherently different. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Sure. Well, first off, it's a very intentional echo, and I think there's a lot we can learn. So there's some differences, but there are definitely some similarities too. And actually, let me continue on the policy ones. We go back and look at the Industrial Revolution. ultimately it led to broadly shared prosperity, and most Americans, most people in the world became much wealthier. But it should be, bear in mind that it didn't just happen automatically. We invented mass public education. Primary education didn't exist beforehand, but as we went from having 90% of the workforce on farms to now it's less than 2%, that progression, the people in the Midwest, it's where it led, they said, we got to get our kids educated, and they came up with this socialist idea of free education for everybody. And later, of course, we had free high school education, and even the college GI Bill. We had Social Security, we had all sorts of changes on antitrust and other things. So there were a lot of, I think, gargantuan changes in policy and society that helped make it possible for the Industrial Revolution to be smooth. I don't want to say it was totally smooth, because there's also a lot of suffering. If you want to, Charles Dickens, you can see that it didn't go smoothly for a lot of people. But there are some differences. The difference that I highlight is this difference between muscle versus brains. You can call it, maybe to some extent production versus coordination. That's a different. And another difference is the speed at which this is happening. I think some of these technologies are just evolving much more rapidly, which may relate to the fact that as we connect billions of brains to each other through the global internet, and now everybody, with a smartphone can access Wikipedia and not just learn from it, but contribute to it. And so there's a lot more knowledge sharing, and growth theory, people, Chad Jones and others have pointed out that the more people you have thinking about how to solve problems, the more likely you're going to come up with solutions to those problems. So that tends to speed up the solutions as well. But the one that concerns me is this issue of substitute versus complement. I mean, are we going to have a situation where there's less and less need for humans or humans with certain sets of skills than we had in the past? Are we going to be able to reskill them and be able to find new things for them to do? And I think most of us don't want to have a society where the pie is getting bigger, but all of that's just going to a handful of people. And so what can we do to create not just prosperity, but shared prosperity? I think that's going to be the big challenge for our society in the next decade or a few decades.
Okay, additional questions? How about right here?
With your Uber slide, you mentioned more capital, less labor. At a system level, isn't it less capital and less labor? And if that's the case, isn't the current policy prescription of low rates to try to boost capital investment using yesterday's playbook?
This is actually a much trickier question. I oversimplified a little bit there. It's true that the share of capital the share of labor is going down, as I showed you, and that's a worldwide phenomenon. I'm not as convinced that is necessarily good news for capital. And that's why I wrote this other paper with Michael Spence and Andy McAfee about ideas and other things, that it's possible that both capital and labor could be losers going forward, and the people who have, who invented Instagram and Facebook and other amazing new systems, Uber for that matter, they don't need a lot of physical capital, they don't need a lot of labor. It's the people who come up with the ideas, the superstars, the last group, that may ultimately be the big winners going forward. So I think it's something that bears a little further analysis. In certain categories, you are substituting capital for labor, but in the longer run, it may be more what you're saying, substituting process innovations and ideas and new ways of doing things, technology for both capital and labor.
Okay. Additional questions? Right here. And then.
Erik, I hate to say this, but your remedies will not solve the problem. Education, entrepreneurship, even taxing the rich are not going to solve problems, especially when you can't distribute the prosperity. If you look at what's happening, look at what happened in New Hampshire. America itself is being polarized. You have the extreme left and the extreme right, both now, and Silicon Valley, we're talking about Google buses. I mean, it won't be long before you start burning down buses over here. It's gotten crazy. And the divide is getting wider because of technology. Grand challenges, we don't have time to make it a grand challenge and have society come together and solve it. What do we do?
Well, I guess I disagree. So Vivek, you've written a lot about this, and you thought very deeply about these growing problems.
I don't have the answers, that's what the problem is.
I know the answers. No, I don't know. But I will put forward my candidate proposals, and that is that this disappointing scenario of growing inequality is not at all inevitable. There's nothing inevitable. Technology is a tool, And it can be used to create more inequality. It can be used to create more shared prosperity. But at the end of the day, it's not what the technology does to us. It's what we decide to do with the technology.
We're regressing as a nation. What are we doing?
Well, I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to comment on how to, sort out the.
Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders
I think.
candidates?
I think both of those are symptoms of what I showed you, that the middle class and a lot of people are not getting a share of this growing pie, and they are angry. I think they have a right to be angry because the system isn't working very well for them. But where I'm more optimistic than what I'm hearing from you is I think that this is a problem that we can address. I do think we can do things in terms of reinventing education. I do think we can do things in terms of changing the way businesses are organized. I do think we can do things in changing the tax structure. I think on all these dimensions, I think if we make the kinds of changes that we made in the first industrial revolution, we're likely to be able to not only have the pie grow, but have a lot of people benefit. Remember, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a world with more wealth and less need for labor, less need for work. That should be good news. I mean, to be able to have more stuff without having to work as much. And shame on us if we turn that into some kind of bad news. And we should be able to set up a system where the rich get richer, the middle class get richer, the poor everyone can get richer simultaneously because the pie is getting bigger. So I guess I'm optimistic that this is a solvable problem, but I would share your concern that this is not going to happen automatically. I'm not with Mark Andreessen and some of the other people who have the view, it seems, that don't worry, it always works out in the end. It works out if we put the effort into it, but it's not automatic. So if we take the time to think about these policy solutions, I think we can overcome some of the negatives and have some of the positives. If we don't, I'm with you. If we do nothing, I could easily see things getting worse and worse.
Kenneth Arrow in the back.
I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit on your discussion with Mark before about the productivity.
Mm-hmm.
What we, even back in around 1985 or so, Bob Solow said, we see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics.
Right.
And it still seems to be true 30 years later.
Right.
I would have thought that improving communication to enable data to be transferred rapidly and quickly and to be able to be retrieved so quickly would have improved the decision-making, let's say, by firms. So they, at a minimum, they'd produce the same things at lower cost. They'd meet demands better, by changing the quality of goods. The system would be more efficient. And
Yeah.
I would have thought that.
Yeah.
Now, it turns out here we have, starting, let's say, with Japan, history after 1991, where any projection of Japan, anybody in 1889 making a projection of Japan would have had a per capita income 50% or 60% higher than what they actually have.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States and Europe are not so different.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are several explanations that are possible. One is we're not measuring output correctly. And I think you hinted at that at one point.
Yes.
That we are better off than it looks. A second is that this all takes a great deal of time.
Yes.
That's what my colleague Paul David pointed out, that electricity had its big impact, namely the improvement in manufacturing, about 30 years later. I'd like to know your view as to why this obvious revolution in capability is not matched by productivity measurements.
Well, it's a great question. You also gave a great answer to it. I should say, Bob Solow's quote inspired me. I was a graduate student when he said that, and that's a big part of why I got into doing this, measuring productivity better. And I think actually I'm just going to double down on the two answers you mentioned. I was going to say them before you mentioned them, but I'll underscore them now. So part of it is measurement. I hinted at some of the free goods. And the thing to bear in mind is that GDP is not a welfare measure. That you can have GDP go up and welfare go down, or vice versa. Let me give you an example. if Encyclopedia Britannica is replaced by Wikipedia, you're spending less on encyclopedias, GDP goes down, you spend nothing on Wikipedia, but your welfare goes way up. If you spend more on cancer, lung cancer treatments, that's not a good thing. It's unfortunate if you have lung cancer, but it would make the GDP go up. So we have to bear in mind that it's not the same thing. And in particular, if you have zero marginal cost goods, like I mentioned, then all bets are off. You're really missing the entire welfare gain when you look only at GDP. So that's part of the story. I wouldn't say that's the whole story. The second part of the story is based on Paul Davids, who I referenced quite a bit in my research, and he made the analogy. He made the analogy that this happened with electricity. It took 30 years for it to play out, and he suggested that similar things would happen with the computer revolution. One difference is that the computer revolution is this rolling, continuous revolution. Every 24 months we get another improvement. Every 5 years it's a 10x improvement. So unlike the one-time jump of the steam engine electricity, we just have continuing improvements, and that means constant reinventions of our organizations and our institutions going forward. And I think that many of these benefits are continuing to be in the future. There's some of the amazing things you can do with artificial intelligence. We've only scratched the surface on doing those. So I think those two are probably the main things that I would say is why the productivity numbers aren't higher. Our welfare isn't fully reflected in the, well, by the way, I should say productivity is directly calculated from GDP. Just so, if you mismeasure GDP and if it's not a welfare measure, then you're going to not measure productivity either. It's just a direct a mathematical relationship. So I would say those are the two main stories going forward.
Okay, so it's 6 o'clock, and we try to finish on time here at CEPR, so please join me in thanking Professor Brynjolfsson.